Welcome to Justice Unfiltered, a legal podcast by Legal Services Clinic, Ramaya College of Law, where we delve into various stories on human rights, justice, and equality. Today's episode is Save Us from Saviours, where we delved into the life of sex workers in India. In today's episode, we are joined by Mr. Rajesh, who is the Executive Director of Sangama Foundation, a leading organization which works for the rights of LGBTQ+ individuals as well as sex workers in India. With over a decade of experience, Mr. Rajesh has been key figure in breaking down barriers of discrimination, providing legal aid, and promoting various policy reforms to create a more inclusive society for vulnerable groups across India. We are honored to have him for a very insightful session which will help the law students, the sex workers, the vulnerable groups across India. We are honored to have him for an insightful session as we'll delve into the challenges faced by the sex workers and the way forward in Indian aspect. So, sir,
Yeah.
sex workers in India often face a lot of stigma as well as discrimination. So, how can they be provided legal aid in India?
Yeah. Before answering that, I think let's look at the basics, right? Because there's a lot of confusion in terms of the definitions itself. So, sex work is primarily when an adult about the age of 18 provides consensual sexual services in exchange of money or other things. So, we're looking at sex work primarily to the construct of work, to the construct of labor framework, right? Now, people exchange the word of sex work but also with prostitution. But prostitution is primarily used in the legal definitions, the legal space, which has a very negative kind of connotation vis-a-vis sex workers are concerned. So globally, sex workers are being referred to in terms of sex work. Now, coming to your question in relation to stigma and discrimination, any community which has been criminalized. In India, sex work is in a very peculiar situation in the construct of law, that sex work is neither legal nor illegal. You have certain kind of acts under Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act, soliciting, for example, other things, brothel keeping, for example, is kind of criminalized. Sex work per se is not kind of illegal. When a community is criminalized, so there's a lot of stigma and discrimination in vis-a-vis access to services. So why does stigma and discrimination for sex workers? One, there's no legal recourse. So there's no kind of legal construct in terms of legal recourse. So that is one issue at play. The other issue at play is generally in society, when people look or view on the issue of sex work, comes from a very deep-rooted prejudice and social morality, right? You're looking at this issue from morality, from my vantage standpoint on what the sex work, because I see sex work, where people rather see sex work as inherently violent, right? Now, let's put it in more simplistic terms, right? Let's take my example, for example. Now, as an individual, I'm working in Sangama, right? I get paid, say about 1,03,000 rupees a month for my role as executive director. In my role as executive director, I'm also using some part of my body to do this work, right? I might be using my hands, I might be using that mind. Sex workers also use some part of their body. Why is that certain parts of body seem to be so-called moralistic and others are not moralistic? I think at the core of the issue for us to understand the whole construct of sex work, to understand the issues of sex workers is, I think, inherently sex work is viewed through the lens of morality. Because we need to go back to the understanding that, again, we need to go back to the Victorian understanding. When you go back to Great Britain, then sex was seen as something which is auspicious. Sex needs to be taken place only when people get married. So sex was only meant for procreation. If you go back historically, sex was not also seen to the construct of pleasure. So you're coming from that standpoint historically. So it becomes very difficult. So then sex workers are marginalized, are pushed to the fringes. As I said, there's no legal recourse, there's no acceptance. So look at any access to services, access to public goods. Sex workers are constantly stigmatized and discriminated. And that is why they kind of get left out in terms of mainstreaming, in terms of that. I think that is where the issue is.
So, sir, as we have talked about sex workers, the stigma and discrimination in aspect of social and morality, right? Now we need to also take it in the aspect of law. So there was a landmark case which was Buddha Dev Karmaskar versus State of West Bengal 2011. So how that connects with the aspect of legal in terms of sex workers?
Let's kind of give a short background to this case, right? Because it's important to understand where this case is. So Buddhadev is actually the accused, right? This was a case which goes back to the state of West Bengal in an area, I think it was in Sonagachi in West Bengal, where a sex worker was brutally assaulted and murdered, right? Then this goes to the High Court in West Bengal, it goes to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court forms a panel in India to look at the situation of sex workers. So as part of that process, today the Supreme Court, rather in the year which you mentioned, the Supreme Court has set out certain directives vis-a-vis sex workers because the government of India didn't kind of act on their previous kind of recommendation, right? The various kind of directives. Shortly put, so the directives which are given is, one is for the law enforcement agencies, right? The police, generally, when you look at sex workers, there's a lot of police violence which happens. So the police have been clearly kind of instructed, told that you cannot use abusive language against sex workers. You cannot assault sex workers. So that is one kind of clear kind of directives which the Supreme Court given, because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and case law vis-a-vis police violence against sex workers. So that is one point of it. The second thing is, condom cannot be considered as evidence under Evidence Act, because just because a sex worker is carrying condom doesn't mean that you can be arrested. That is second. Third is, when raids kind of take place in brothels and settings, generally what happens is your police kind of raids. So there's a media spectacle, there's a voyeurism which happens, photographs, the names are displayed, revealed. The Supreme Court has said that no, people's right to privacy is a fundamental right, because they're kind of, again going back, because the Puttaswamy judgment kind of spoke about the right to privacy and saying that every individual has their right, so you cannot disclose sex workers' personal information. So there are also directives to the media that you cannot kind of cover. And then it was also, directives were also given for law enforcement agencies, the National Legal Services Authority, the State Legal Services Authority, and the District Legal Services Authority, to ensure that sex workers are provided large-scale legal trainings and kind of free kind of legal support which is being provided. They have also given directives to the governments to ensure that there's a survey of state homes which has been done, and if any sex worker has been kind of confined or kind of put in terms of a state home or shelter for against their own violation, need to be immediately released. So these are kind of very important directives which the Supreme Court has finally kind of given. So now that is the context in terms of this case. So the important part here is, and in the first part of this interview, we spoke about social morality, right? Now, it's important to go back and to kind of talk about constitutional morality, right? The issue of sex work, we believe, needs to be seen through a legal framework, right? And what legal framework I mean? I'm saying that sex work needs to be seen from a viewpoint of labor framework. Sex work should be seen as part of the informal labor system, and there it is in line with constitutional morality. Now, the idea of constitutional morality is very interesting. Now, if you go back to when the Constitution was written in the Constituent Assembly debates. Now, Ambedkar says, and I quote him verbatim, constitutional morality is not a natural sentiment. It has to be cultivated, because deep down, India is an undemocratic kind of country, right? So the idea of constitutional morality is, we can have multiple kind of moralities, but law and countries needs to be governed based on the constitution. The constitution has given us a set of rights, a set of ethos. Under the constitution, every citizen, equality, right to dignity, right? So the idea of constitutional morality is paramount to our understanding. And that is where I believe, where you look at this case, you look at the Puttaswamy judgment, the largest bench which looked at right to privacy, you look at the Navtej Singh Johar judgment, where it looked at reading down of section 377, which criminalized same-sex behavior. So all these judgments are coming from a standpoint of constitutional morality. Because the reason I'm bringing the argument of constitutional morality is, at its core, I think the issue of sex work is, I think there are two kind of battles which happens in the viewpoint of sex work, right? One is social morality versus constitutional morality. And second one, there is an inherent ploy to conflate trafficking with sex work. Now, trafficking is separate. We're not talking of trafficking. We're talking about sex workers who consent to sex work on their own volition. And that is where our focus is. Trafficking is bad. Trafficking is criminalized. There's a lot of social issues there. But there is a tendency to conflate trafficking with sex work. And the understanding then is all sex workers are kind of trafficked. And when it comes to the issue of sex workers is, the problematic thing is, many people think that sex workers don't have agency, right? And that's the problem with sex work, because yes, there is and also you look at it, right? Even the feminist understanding on sex work has evolved, because feminists also have taken this very kind of problematic stand on sex work. Oh no, sex work is inherently violent, right? Because it has its undertones with patriarchal understanding and all and on, and different kind of terms for it. But I'm saying, if somebody gets into sex work on their own volition, who are we to question that choice of that person? Because choice is fundamental to dignity. So who are we to question? I'll leave it there.
So, sir, as we have talked about the social morality as well as the constitutional morality, there are certain aspects in which law is there in the books itself, but on practical grounds, whether it is followed by the implementation or the administration which is doing it, whether it is following in the particular aspect or not, sir. So as in India, we understand that the police harassment is quite prevalent across nation. So with regards to sex workers, are there any personal stories which you can share, and how the police should actually deal with people who are involved in sex work?
If you look at most judgments in India, right, you might have the best judgments, but has it been implemented in its true spirit and totality? Then that's the question to kind of look at, right? With most marginalized communities, you don't see that. And the police are a law enforcement, right? You enforce law. But then when police itself becomes the perpetrators of violence, it happens for across marginalized communities, right? It happened with gender and sexual minorities. We're looking at sex workers, look at religious minorities, look at Dalits, cutting across. So, and now the role of the police, right? Because when the police see or view any community which is either criminalized or any community which is marginalized, the police tend to be more violative. That's an inherent nature. Now, coming back in Karnataka, for example, and there's this particular very interesting thing which happened. Now, in Majestic, the Supapet police station, you had the police which formed something called as the Obava Pade. Now, the Obava Pade which is a group of team which kind of goes around, right? Sex workers are bad and we need to clean Bangalore. So sex workers has to be swept away. So in terms of this kind of understanding. And the police, if you look at Majestic, there's been instances of enormous cases of police violence against sex workers. Now, the recent SHRC order, the State Human Rights Commission order, is very interesting and very paramount, because they kind of, they say in that order that the police were liable for these actions, and a certain fine was also kind of put against the police. So you need to kind of look at that, because police violence continues to, and police violence continues, they continue to be brazen about it. Now, if you go to the police, I'm saying that if you look at the police, there's an entire bureaucracy at that level, right? Your SP, probably your DCPs are more aware of laws, legality and all of that. But the issue here is not people sitting up there. They could also be the issue, but it is your police constable who's there. Now, Does the police constable have an understanding of the Supreme Court directives of these things? No. I think there's a lot of work which needs to happen there, where they also need to be sensitized and told that no, people need to be treated as humans. When you become a violator rather than the protector, then action has to be taken. Only when action taken, then people tend to fall in line. But that is where the whole issue of police violence is. And the other thing is, how do we address police violence other than the legal part of it is, I believe when sex workers collectives are organized, when communities are strong enough, and then generally we have seen examples and instances of police violence comes down because of the collective power of communities. So there's enough empirical data to say that when communities are collectivized, when communities are organized, when they're strong, then in those situations, police violence kind of comes down because you're looking at the collective power of a marginalized community.
So, as we have identified a huge gap between the practical implementation of the laws, rulings, or the guidelines which are issued by various government organizations and Supreme Court judgment as well. So, we, as being law students and also coming from legal services clinic, legal aid clinics in various law colleges, how can we take certain initiative to make awareness with regards to what are the guidelines, how the police should handle, and how to sensitize these kind of topics?
Yeah. See, the legal fraternity, I believe, plays an important role, right? There are three parts. One is there has to be a lot of awareness, right, on the law itself. And I would say for both the establishment, where I include police, and also to the sex workers, right? And then kind of looking at providing legal support in terms of access to those. Probably, I'm thinking aloud, one model which could work in terms of providing awareness is, can there be some sort of a joint collaboration between legal clinics, law students, and sex workers jointly and do these sessions? So then you're looking at two. One is you're looking at lived realities of sex workers, their issues, and then you're looking at constitution, law, legality. I think that collaboration could play an important role in kind of ensuring there's a clear and proper and factual understanding vis-a-vis sex workers in India is concerned.
So, as the sex work is not totally decriminalized in India, there are certain aspects which is soliciting which are still illegal.
Yes.
So, if we assume or if we want to totally decriminalize sex work in India, how will it impact the society from social morality as well as the constitutional morality? What are the rules or regulation which are like totally needed to brought in to protect the sex workers, and also how will it impact the society?
See, one of the long-standing demands of the sex workers movement is you're looking at complete decriminalization of sex work. The Law Commission, I'm aware, has recommended that sex work needs to be decriminalized. I'm saying you need to look at the issue of sex work through the construct of labor. Sex work is a form of labor. When you move the discourse from looking at morality, whether it's social morality, and you look at sex work to purely to the construct of labor, to the construct of occupation, then you have to decriminalize sex work, right? So one way is you completely decriminalize sex work. Then sex workers are not marginalized. There's better access to services. There's this issue of dignity and all of that. So that is one way to kind of look at this issue, right? Now, they're kind of different models. One model is, okay, now let's take a step back, right? Now, what are the legal models vis-a-vis sex workers across globally, right? That you have a criminalization model. That sex workers in certain countries are completely kind of criminalized. Then you have countries where sex work is neither criminalized nor decriminalized. It's a very peculiar kind of gray zone. Then you have countries where sex work is completely legalized and regulated. Then you have countries where sex work is completely decriminalized, but they've not gone towards legalization. What do I mean by legalization? Regulation is a sex work is seen as a form of occupation, so you are legalized. So there's regulation. So sex workers tend to pay taxes to your government. So it's part of any other kind of work, right? So these are different kind of global models. In India, we're looking at complete decriminalization. As I said, there's enough data to show that when you criminalize sex workers, you are pushed. So I'm again reinforcing the point that sex work needs to be pushed away through the construct of morality and look at sex work purely through a labor construct. Sex workers are workers. Let's visualize sex workers to the construct of work, try to bring them under the informal economy, and I think then sex workers will be empowered. Then you're looking at better access of sex workers to services. Issues on stigma, discrimination will not completely go away, right? Now, stigma, discrimination is another issue. Now, look at any other form of informal labor, for example, right? Domestic work or other work. There's also some sort of discrimination which happens. That's another issue, but you need to get it out, push it outside of criminalization, gray zone, and move into the zone of decriminalization.
So, sir, as you talked about various model, one such model is Nordic model, which is followed in other countries. So, what are the pros and cons of that model? And also, if we can bring that particular model and implement in India itself, sir.
See, now the Nordic model is a very problematic model, right? Let's go back to history. So, when the discussion around sex work on different kind of models were getting discussed, I think in the year 1999, Sweden brought in a law which basically said that purchasing sex will be criminalized. So then you can also understand it as you're criminalizing clients. You're saying, okay, as a sex worker, you have a right, you do what you want. But what we will do is we will look at the demand issue, right? They're understanding once there's no demand, then there will be no sex work. So radical feminists in Sweden kind of the entire premise of this argument was something called as a concept called as false consciousness. Now it's an interesting concept because Frederick Engels and talks about this the idea of false consciousness. Basically, what is the concept of false consciousness? In simplistic terms, false consciousness means, sex workers are not objectively self-aware. They can't think about their motivation. They're not clear. So you need somebody to kind of talk on their behalf. The idea is sex workers cannot think objectively. They're not self-aware of themselves because they're being pushed into sex work in this very dangerous, peculiar circumstance. And that is where the idea of false consciousness comes, and they use this argument. Now, the problem is this. Sex workers have always argued. One of the important slogans of the sex workers movement has been "Save us from Saviours." We don't need anyone to save, right? Leave us with dignity. Who are you all to come and to kind of save us? Because there's nothing here, right? So that is the idea. So the problem with this, then other countries like Norway and others kind of used this model. There was also, if I remember correctly, there's also one or two High Court judgments also in India which said that clients has to be criminalized. I think it was the Andhra Pradesh High Court. I think we need to cross-check on that. But this has been part of the global discourse on sex work. Basically, the idea is, look, let's criminalize clients. Let's look at the demand thing. Then invariably, sex work, the fundamental logic is when you diminish demand, so sex worker will kind of come down. Now, it's deeply problematic because enough studies in Sweden, in Norway, has shown the moment when you get into this kind of thing, then you push sex work into underground. So violence, lack of access to services has been skyrocketed. Right? And most in these countries also sex workers mostly they're also immigrants who come from other countries. So you push into underground, there's no legal recourse, violence goes up, there's no lack of services. You look at social services, social security, health services. So there's enough data, research to say, backed by evidence, that Nordic model has been a failure. Again, I'm going back. It's because there in Sweden, it came out from this understanding, from the radical feminist understanding that sex work is inherently violent. You came in from an idea of false consciousness, for morality, and said that no, sex workers needs to be saved. This attitude of savior complex or savior attitude needs to be punctured right there.
So, sir, as it has been around 15 years that you have been working for sex workers in Karnataka itself and across India, so what do you think, what are the changes which you have seen in these 15 years, and what is the future of sex workers in India? How the laws or which might come in future, or what actual groundwork shall be done in order to make more inclusive environment for sex workers in India?
I think one of the biggest contribution I see is sex workers today are collectivized. There's very strong sex worker-led collectives in India. The large sex worker networks. In India, you had a national network of sex workers. You had the All India network of sex workers. So at the level of the community, there's been a lot of collectivization which happens, a lot of consciousness which has kind of taken place. There's also been important developments vis-a-vis sex workers concerned, right? The 2022, in the month of May, I think the important directives of the Supreme Court is a directive in a very kind of in the right way. That is one. Second thing, I still remember at the time of COVID, the National Human Rights Commission had put out an advisory where it looked at sex work to the construct of informal work. But there's a lot of backlash by the abolitionists, and then they had to kind of retract. So there's also that happening, right? Because the abolitionists have a lot of resources with them. So there's a very strong movement also to abolish sex work, which is also kind of taking place. So the sex workers movement is in this very peculiar kind of situation, very difficult kind of situation. Going forward, as I've said, the way forward is that sex work has to be decriminalized. Sex workers have time and again said that, please don't save us from Saviours. We do not want anybody's sympathy, nothing. Leave us the way we want to live our lives. We will lead our lives as per the Constitution. We will lead our lives as per dignity. That's all it is. And I think we can kind of get into jargons. We can kind of we can also kind of continue to have intellectual kind of conversations, get into academic kind of things. I'm coming back to it of what I started. At the core of this issue is it's about morality. That's all. It's nothing else in terms of how sex work. It's my own morality which is kind of contributing to this discourse on sex work, right? Look at sex work to any other form of work as a form of occupation. I started with my own example. Why does certain parts of body which is seen okay and why certain parts of body which is not seen okay, right? Because all of us use, in a capitalist society, all of us use one part of our body to make a living, right? I give my own example. I'm speaking, I'm using my mind to talk. The same thing, sex workers also use different parts of bodies. Why is that certain parts of body where this very kind of inherent moralistic understanding towards the issue of sex, sexuality, sex worker itself, and why others are not? I think that is the question which I believe, which all of us need to kind of think through. In conclusion, I would go back and again say that at the core of our discourse, of whatever we think through, is we need to look only through the prism of constitutional morality. All of us are governed, guided. Probably one of the fascinating constitutions across the globe. You had the South African constitution again, which came back from a struggle there. Similarly, we have our own constitution. I think laws, legislations, and as citizens, we need to be governed by our constitution. Our constitution talks about rights to equality, dignity at its core. I think that is where the issue is. And I'm hopeful that at least down the years, we will see a complete decriminalization of sex work in India.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for this insightful session. And I hope the audience will also feel motivated and understand the actual perspective, the groundwork, the constitutional morality, the social morality, and all the aspect in which we as individuals, as a society, should make it more inclusive for sex workers in India. Thank you so much.